The country you think you are living in does not exist anymore. I need you to hear that. I am not being dramatic. I am not trying to scare you for clicks. I am telling you what the exposed wiring of the American economy looks like right now, in April of 2026, when you strip away the stock market headlines and the politicians telling you everything is under control. Because everything is not under control. The United States government just crossed $39 trillion in national debt. Not projected, not estimated, crossed. That number moves at $8 billion a day. That is $334 million an hour. That is $5.5 million every single minute. And the interest alone on that debt is now projected to hit $1.04 trillion this fiscal year. Let me say that differently, so it sinks in. The federal government will spend more money this year just paying interest on what it already owes than it spends on the entire Department of Defense and the Department of Education combined. We are not building anything with that money. We are not fixing a road, feeding a child, or defending a border. We are handing $1 trillion a year to bondholders because previous Congresses and presidents spent money they did not have and kicked the bill forward to you and your children. The Congressional Budget Office projects that by 2036, interest payments alone will reach $2.1 trillion annually. That is not a typo. $2.1 trillion a year just to service debt. The federal deficit for fiscal year 2026 is $1.9 trillion. In just the first 5 months of this fiscal year, the government has already borrowed over $1 trillion, and the national debt as a share of the economy is now at 101% of GDP, meaning America owes more than its entire economy produces in a year. By 2036, that ratio is projected to hit 120%, smashing the previous record set in 1946 right after we fought a world war. Except this time, there is no world war to justify it. There is no great infrastructure program. There is no moonshot. There is just spending, borrowing, spending more, and hoping nobody notices. And here is the part that should terrify you. 9 in 10 Americans told the Peterson Foundation that they believe this rising debt is driving up the cost of living. They are right. When the government borrows at this scale, it competes with households and businesses for capital in the bond market. That pushes interest rates higher for everyone. Your mortgage, your car loan, your credit card. The government's addiction to debt is making your life more expensive, and nobody in Washington has a plan to stop it, because stopping it would require either cutting programs people depend on or raising taxes on people who vote, and neither party is willing to do either one. What most people do not realize is that the American consumer, the person who is supposed to be the backbone of this economy, the engine that drives 70% of GDP, is already broken. Total household debt in the United States just hit $18.8 trillion in the fourth quarter of 2025. That is the highest level ever recorded by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York since they began tracking in 1999. Credit card debt alone has exploded to $1.28 trillion, and that number crossed the $1.3 trillion mark by early 2026. Since the first quarter of 2021, credit card balances have surged by $507 billion. That is a 66% increase in less than 5 years. And here is the part that nobody wants to talk about. Roughly half of all active credit card holders in this country, about 111 million people, cannot pay off their balances in full every month. They are carrying debt from month to month at an average interest rate above 22%. More than 27 million Americans can only afford the minimum payment. The minimum. Do you know what that means? It means they are barely treading water. They are paying interest on interest. They are in a financial trap that was designed by the banks to keep them there. A joint report from the Century Foundation and Protect Borrowers found that Americans have paid a cumulative total of $2.1 trillion in credit card interest since 2010. That is more than the total outstanding student loan debt in this country. And 55% of consumers are now using credit cards to cover essential expenses like groceries, utilities, and childcare. This is not irresponsible spending. This is survival spending. The K-shaped economy that economists have been warning about is real. There is an affluent half of the population whose financial lives are not disrupted by anything. And then there is everyone else. The people for whom financial triage and daily trade-offs are a way of life. And the delinquency numbers prove it. Overall delinquency rates rose to 4.8% of all outstanding household debt in the fourth quarter of 2025, the highest level since 2017. Bloomberg reported that the deterioration is being driven by higher defaults among low-income and young borrowers. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York said the pain is concentrated in lower-income zip codes and in areas with declining home prices. This is not a recession that shows up in GDP numbers. This is a recession that shows up in kitchen table conversations across America. Here is something that should make the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Social Security, the program that more than 70 million Americans depend on for their retirement, is now projected to become insolvent by late 2032, not 2040, not some distant future your grandchildren will deal with. Late 2032, 6.5 years from right now. The Congressional Budget Office released a report confirming that the Old Age and Survivors Insurance Trust Fund will be depleted, and when it is, benefits will be cut automatically by roughly 24% across the board. That is not a political threat. That is current law. The program legally cannot pay out more than it takes in through payroll taxes once the trust fund is empty. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget estimated that a typical dual-earning couple retiring right after insolvency would face an annual benefit cut of $18,100. Think about that, an $18,000 per year cut in income for a retired couple who planned their entire life around that money being there. And the problem has been made worse by recent legislation. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act reduced the revenue Social Security collects from taxing benefits, which the program's own chief actuary says accelerated the insolvency date from early 2033 to late 2032. The Social Security Fairness Act, while well-intentioned, added another $200 billion in costs over 10 decades, and the dramatic decline in immigration is shrinking the payroll tax base even further. There used to be more than 5 workers paying into the system for every retiree collecting benefits. That ratio has now dropped below 3-to-1, and it is falling. Young women are having fewer children, which means in 20 years the ratio gets even worse. The Bipartisan Policy Center has put it bluntly. The program faces a 75-year shortfall of $25 trillion. Congress last reformed Social Security more than 40 years ago, and there is no serious legislative effort happening right now to fix it. The clock is ticking at a volume that should be deafening, but Washington is not listening. If you are between the ages of 50 and 65, this is no longer a future problem. This is your problem. It will hit during your retirement, and it will reshape everything you thought your golden years would look like. The housing market in this country has become something that a normal working family cannot participate in, and most people have not fully absorbed how extreme the situation has become. Before the pandemic, a median-income household in America could actually afford to buy a median-priced home. That was the basic economic contract. You work hard, you save, you buy a house. That contract is broken. Brookings published data showing that today, a household needs an income of roughly $120,000 a year to qualify for a mortgage on a median-priced home. The actual median household income is about $85,000. That is a $35,000 gap between what American families earn and what they need to buy an average house. The National Association of Home Builders reported that 77% of all U.S. households cannot afford just the median price of a new single-family home. 77%. For every $1,000 increase in the price of a new home, 116,000 more households get priced out. Mortgage rates hit 6.57% in spring 2026, which means a $400,000 loan now costs more than $2,550 a month, compared to about $2,050 per month at the 3% rates we saw during the pandemic. That is a 24% increase in the monthly cost of owning the exact same house with the exact same walls and the exact same roof, just because interest rates went up. Existing home sales dropped 8.4% month over month in January, the steepest decline in nearly 4 years. The median age of a first-time home buyer has climbed to a record 38 years old. In Los Angeles, you need a household income of $160,000 just to qualify for a mortgage on the median home. In California, it takes more than 25 years to save for a 10% down payment. In New York City, it takes over 30. The St. Louis Federal Reserve published research showing that from 2000 to 2024, median home prices rose 207% in nominal terms, while median per capita income grew only 155%. The gap between what homes cost and what people earn has been widening for a quarter century, and it is accelerating. There is a nationwide housing shortfall of nearly 4 million homes, according to Realtor.com, which means even if rates dropped tomorrow, the inventory is not there. The American dream of homeownership is not dying. For tens of millions of families, it is already dead. And the people in power keep talking about it like it is a temporary blip that will fix itself when rates come down. Rates are not coming down fast enough, and even if they did, the supply problem alone would keep prices elevated for years. Now let me talk about something that is happening right under your nose at your workplace, and most people still think it is years away. Artificial intelligence is not coming for jobs in some distant future. It is taking them right now, today, and the way it is happening is so quiet that most Americans will not realize their position has been eliminated until they are sitting in an HR office being handed a severance package. A Duke University survey of 750 chief financial officers found that roughly 44% of businesses plan to make AI-related layoffs in 2026. That translates to approximately 502,000 positions across the economy. And researchers noted that white-collar jobs would account for half of those cuts. Block, the fintech company founded by Jack Dorsey, announced it is shrinking its workforce from 10,000 employees to 6,000 as AI tools accelerate the company's productivity. Salesforce eliminated 4,000 customer support roles, citing efficiency gains from agentic AI. Amazon CEO Andy Jassy said the company expects to shrink its number of white-collar jobs as it invests in AI agents. Pinterest framed its layoffs as a redirect toward AI systems. Dave is cutting 4,500 jobs as it ramps up automation. Goldman Sachs estimates that 6 to 7% of U.S. workers could lose their jobs because of AI adoption. The Stanford Digital Economy Lab found that entry-level hiring in AI-exposed occupations has dropped 13% since large language models started proliferating. And here is the most unsettling part. A lot of these layoffs are not even being announced as layoffs. Companies are doing what researchers call quiet attrition. Someone retires, and the position is not filled. A team of 12 becomes a team of 8 after 2 people leave. The desk stays, the monitor stays, the job does not come back. A viral Citrini research report warned of a doom loop where AI agents replace office workers, companies fatten their profit margins, invest more in AI, and fire more workers. Dario Amodei, the CEO of Anthropic, warned that AI could eliminate half of all entry-level white-collar jobs within 5 years, potentially pushing unemployment to 10 or 20%. Nearly 60% of U.S. hiring managers surveyed by Resume.org said they plan to conduct layoffs in 2026, and AI was the most cited reason. But here is the ugly truth behind a lot of these numbers. Many companies are AI washing their layoffs. They are blaming artificial intelligence for cuts that are actually driven by financial underperformance, overhiring during the pandemic boom, or just plain cost-cutting. Only about 9% of hiring managers said AI has fully replaced certain roles, but 60% admitted they emphasize AI's role because it is viewed more favorably than admitting financial constraints. So you have a situation where AI is genuinely taking some jobs. Companies are exaggerating AI's role to justify taking more jobs, and workers in the middle have no idea which category their position falls into until the pink slip arrives. Let me tell you about the jobs picture more broadly, because the numbers coming out of the Bureau of Labor Statistics should be setting off alarm bells in every corner of this country. The U.S. economy lost 92,000 jobs in February 2026. Economists had forecasted a gain of 59,000. That is a miss of over 150,000 jobs. And it was not a one-month anomaly. Job growth has turned negative in 5 of the last 9 months. When you go back and look at the revisions, the kind of adjustments the BLS makes quietly after the initial headlines have faded, employment growth has basically been at a standstill since January of 2025. Average monthly employment growth since April of last year has been just 17,000 jobs a month. Brookings published an analysis pointing out that historically that level would signal a labor market in crisis. But because immigration has declined so dramatically, with net migration falling to 1.3 million in 2025 from 2.8 million in 2024, the labor force itself is shrinking. So the unemployment rate does not spike the way you would expect, because fewer people are entering the pool. It is a statistical illusion. The economy looks stable on the surface because the denominator is shrinking alongside the numerator. But underneath that illusion, the quit rate has been falling, meaning workers are staying in jobs they do not want because they are afraid to leave. After-tax wage growth for lower-income households has slowed to just 1.4%, while higher-income households are seeing 4% growth. The gap between the top and the bottom is widening at a pace that should alarm every policymaker in Washington. Consumer sentiment has been declining for 3 consecutive quarters. The Conference Board Consumer Confidence Index, one of the most closely watched economic gauges in the world, keeps dropping. When consumers lose confidence, they spend less. When they spend less, corporate revenues fall. When revenues fall, companies lay people off. And when people get laid off, confidence collapses further. That is not a theory. That is a cycle that has preceded every recession in the last 50 years. The Federal Reserve is trapped in a box that it built for itself, and most people do not understand how dangerous that box is. Inflation came in at 2.4% year over year in the most recent CPI report. That sounds close to the Fed's 2% target, but core inflation, which strips out food and energy, is sitting at 2.6% and has been stuck there. The Fed held interest rates steady at its January meeting after 3 consecutive cuts in late 2025 that brought the range down to 3.5 to 3.75%. But here is the problem. The war in Iran has sent oil prices above $100 a barrel. The Strait of Hormuz disruption is sending shockwaves through global energy markets. Diesel and jet fuel prices are climbing, and those costs flow through every single supply chain in the American economy within weeks, not months. Food prices have already climbed nearly 24% above pre-pandemic levels. Mortgage rates, which had briefly dipped below 6%, reversed and climbed back to 6.57%. The Fed cannot cut rates to help the housing market or the job market because cutting rates would pour gasoline on the inflation fire. But if the Fed keeps rates elevated to fight inflation, the housing market stays frozen, the job market keeps weakening, and the consumer continues to drown in high-interest debt. This is the classic stagflation trap. Slow growth plus persistent inflation, it is the hardest environment for a central bank to navigate, and the 1970s showed us what happens when they get it wrong. Multiple independent forecasters, including JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and the IMF, have raised their probability of a U.S. recession in 2026 to between 40 and 50%. That is not a tail risk anymore. That is a coin flip. And the yield curve, which has one of the most reliable recession prediction track records of any indicator in finance, inverted sharply in late 22 and stayed inverted through most of 2023 and 2024. It is now uninverted, which is the part most people miss. Historically, the recession does not arrive during the inversion. It arrives when the curve normalizes, because that is when the Fed has already cut rates in response to economic deterioration that is already underway. That pattern matched perfectly before the 2001 dot-com crash and the 2008 financial crisis, and it is matching again right now. The CBO projects real GDP growth at 2.3% for 2026, but Deloitte's downside scenario projects the economy could contract 0.4% in 2027 and 1% in 2028, with unemployment rising to 6.5%. That is not a soft landing. That is a crash in slow motion, disguised by headline numbers that look acceptable today but are masking deterioration that has already begun underneath. There is a shadow financial system that most Americans have never heard of, and it is growing at a speed that should make every regulator in this country lose sleep. Private credit markets have ballooned in size while operating with far less oversight than traditional banks. These are not your neighborhood community bank lenders. These are massive private equity funds, hedge funds, and non-bank financial institutions that are extending billions in loans to companies that traditional banks will not touch. And the reason they will not touch them is because the risk is too high. But private credit funds do not have to follow the same capital requirements as banks. They do not have the same transparency rules. They do not have FDIC oversight. They operate in a regulatory gray zone where leverage can build and nobody outside the fund even knows how much exposure exists until something blows up. Companies are increasingly tapping these markets to fund AI-related investments, and Deloitte warns that this could create negative spillover effects if those companies cannot repay their debt. Capital Economics issued a warning that the combination of leverage and illiquidity in private credit rarely ends well when growth slows. A single fund blowing up is not a macro event. But a freezing of wider credit markets would be, and sitting right next to the private credit time bomb is the commercial real estate disaster. Office vacancies across the country are at historic highs. Companies that went remote during the pandemic never came back, and the buildings they abandoned are now worth a fraction of what was borrowed against them. Regional banks across America are sitting on hundreds of billions in commercial real estate loans, and a massive wave of refinancing deadlines is hitting in 2026 and 2027. When those loans come due, the buildings backing them are not worth what they were appraised at, which means banks take losses, which means credit tightens, which means small businesses that depend on those banks for lending suddenly cannot get the capital they need to operate. And nobody is talking about this because the losses have not hit the headline numbers yet. They are sitting on bank balance sheets like unexploded ordnance, waiting for the right economic downturn to detonate. Meanwhile, equity markets are trading at valuations that approach dot-com bubble territory. After a long rally fueled by AI hype, it would only take a couple of missed earnings targets to puncture confidence. The hyperscalers, the the Microsofts and Googles and Amazons of the world have announced hundreds of billions in AI capital expenditure for 2026. But business surveys show that most other companies are far more hesitant to spend. There is an enormous gap between the companies building AI infrastructure and the companies that are supposed to buy and use AI products. If that gap does not close, if the demand for AI does not materialize at the scale these companies are betting on, you are looking at the classic ingredients of a bubble: massive capital investment, inflated expectations, and a sudden reassessment of reality. Deloitte projects that if AI investment gets overdone, real business investment could decline by 3.2% in 2027, followed by another 0.7% drop in 2028. That would send shockwaves through the tech-heavy stock market and wipe out trillions in household wealth held in retirement accounts. And remember, for millions of Americans, their 401k is their only meaningful savings. A 10% stock market decline, which Capital Economics says would knock a couple tenths of a percent off GDP, sounds mild on paper. But when it happens to a consumer who is already maxed out on credit cards and watching their grocery bill climb every month, that portfolio hit is the thing that pushes them from treading water to going under. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget warned that policymakers are woefully underprepared to address the next economic shock in a fiscally responsible way. The country will almost certainly enter the next crisis more indebted than it has ever been, which may significantly hamper the ability to mount an appropriate response. In 2008, the government could borrow and spend its way out of the crisis because the debt-to-GDP ratio was around 64%. Today, it is 101%. In 2020, the government could send out stimulus checks because interest rates were near zero. Today, the federal funds rate is above 3.5%, and the government is already paying $1 trillion a year in interest. The fiscal bazooka that Washington used to rescue the economy twice in 12 years is out of ammunition. The tools that saved us in 2008 and 2020 are either broken or dramatically weakened. And the next crisis is not a question of if, it is a question of when. Here is what I need you to understand, and I need you to really sit with this for a moment. All of these problems, the debt, the consumer breakdown, the Social Security cliff, the housing catastrophe, the AI displacement, the job market deterioration, the Fed's impossible position, the shadow financial risks, none of them exist in isolation. They are all connected. They feed into each other like gears in a machine designed to grind the average American family into dust. A consumer drowning in credit card debt at 22% interest cannot absorb a food price shock when diesel pushes grocery costs up another 15%. A worker whose job just got replaced by an AI agent cannot make a mortgage payment at 6.57% on a house that cost 24% more per month than it did 3 years ago. A retiree who gets a 24% cut to Social Security benefits cannot prop up the consumer spending that drives 70% of GDP. A government paying $1 trillion a year in interest, borrowing $8 billion a day, cannot fund the infrastructure, education, or job retraining programs that might cushion these blows. And a Federal Reserve caught between an inflation spike from the Iran war and a labor market that is quietly falling apart cannot deploy the monetary firepower that bailed out the economy the last 2 times it fell off a cliff. Every single safety net, every buffer, every emergency tool that this country has relied on for the last 50 years is either depleted, compromised, or pointed in the wrong direction. The economy that most people think they are living in, the one where the stock market goes up and the unemployment rate stays low and the headlines say everything is fine, that economy is a hologram. It is a projection built on statistical quirks, top-heavy wealth concentration, and a media ecosystem that does not know how to tell you the truth without scaring you into changing the channel. The richest 10% of Americans own 93% of all stocks. When the market goes up, it is their wealth going up, not yours. The unemployment rate stays low because the workforce is shrinking due to immigration cuts, not because companies are hiring. GDP growth looks acceptable because AI hyperscalers are pouring hundreds of billions into data centers, while the bottom half of the country puts groceries on a credit card they cannot pay off. But the real economy, the one where 111 million people cannot pay off their credit cards, where a median-income family cannot afford a median-priced home, where Social Security is 6 years from automatic benefit cuts, where student loan delinquency has spiked to 9.6%, where 4.8% of all household debt is in some stage of delinquency, where the national debt grows by $93,000 every single second. That economy is sending every warning signal it knows how to send, and most people cannot see it yet because they have been trained to look at the wrong indicators. They watch the Dow Jones instead of the delinquency rates. They listen to politicians instead of actuaries. They hear GDP growth and assume everything is working when the growth is being captured by a handful of trillion-dollar corporations while 175 million credit card holders scramble to make their minimum payments. Something is very wrong. The data says it. The actuaries say it. The economists at Brookings, Deloitte, the CBO, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, all of them are saying it in their own careful, institutional language. I am just saying it in a way that you can actually hear. The question is not whether you believe me. The question is whether you are going to prepare before the rest of the country wakes up and realizes it too. Because by then, it will be too late to prepare. It will only be time to react. And reacting from behind, with no savings, no equity, no emergency fund, and a government that is too broke to bail you out. That is how people lose everything. That is how families go from middle class to struggling in a single year. And that year might already be the one you are living in right now.